Hello, and welcome to UK Paranormal Files. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a case that is a little out of our jurisdiction. Today's file is the legend of the trans-dimensional gas station. In 2005, a post appeared on the Charles Fort Institute Internet Forum from a user called Auroborous. Auroborous would sign off his post under the name David. David posted an account from his memory that piqued the interest of the Forteans on the forum and left an account that is still talked about to this day. David is from Sweden, which is the setting for his story. We're going to take a look at David's story and as close to his original rendering as is possible. August 17, 2005. Hi all, this is my first post on this forum, and before I go any further, I should perhaps apologise in advance for any misspellings and deformed sentences. English is not my first language. The event I'd like to tell you about took place quite a few years ago, in the early 90s. Somehow I managed not to think about it for all this time. Recently, however, following somewhat of a crisis in my life, I've started to realise how fundamentally strange this experience really was, and how deeply it actually affected me. I'll try to provide as much detail as I possibly can drag from my admittedly foggy memory, so bear with me if my account seems windy and overly pedantic. As far as I remember, my story took place in early July 1993. I was 18 years old at the time and worked for the summer at the civic department of the smallish county of commune of Jolby, doing mainly street and park maintenance. Me and a co-worker had finished work for the day pruning hedges and mowing lawns in a remote community some 10 English miles away from our home office and were on our way back. The road we were driving along in a Volkswagen minibus went through a quite rural area, fields and scattered bits of pine forest. There were only a few separated farmhouses and cottages along the road, which is the only tarmac road in that area. All roads that connect with it along that stretch are either gravel roads or dirt paths. That summer alone we must have driven along that road at least 100 times, so we knew it quite well by that time. After driving approximately 5 to 7 kilometres along this road, my co-worker, who was driving, happened to notice that we were running low on gas. In fact, the needle of the gauge didn't even move from its bottom position. The car was still running smoothly, but we doubted we could run on petrol fumes for another 10 kilometres or so. At this point we had entered one of the few places along the road where it's flanked by woods on both sides. The area is otherwise fairly open, mostly farmland. The car was equipped with a long-wave radio, this being before the time of mobile phones, so we were discussing whether to radio the home office in case we got stranded and needed some gas brought to us. In the end, however, we decided to keep on driving as long as possible, just in case the gas we had would be enough to take us home. Come to think about it, I seem to remember that stretch of road lay in some type of radio shadow. The regular radio stations always broke up at some point along that road, although I can't remember if we had the radio on this particular occasion. Anyway, we kept on driving for a few more minutes when suddenly we came upon a small collection of buildings on the right side of the road. A farmhouse in a pretty dilapidated condition, covered in grubby Eternit plates. I'm not sure of the English name, but it's an asbestos-like synthetic substance which was used extensively in house exteriors in the 50s and 60s. In front of the house, right up against the edge of the tarmac of the road, sat a long shed-type structure covered in corrugated metal plate and roofed with tar paper. On the short end of the shed, facing the way we were coming from, was an old orange-striped gas pump. Set into the side of the shed was an open door and a large grimy window cluttered with cans of motor oil and other stuff. In this window hung a large plastic sign saying simply, gas. As I mentioned, we'd both travelled along this road many times, but never noticed this strange looking gas station before. However, there were no eldritch feeling of strangeness or anything. We simply wrote it off as a trick of the mind that neither of us had seen it before or had thought about it earlier. After all, sometimes you fail to notice the mundane things until you actively search for them. I certainly didn't reflect much over it at the time, just feeling relieved that we would be able to get some gas and get home. We stopped alongside the gas pump, and after finding the mechanism locked with a padlock, I went inside to find whoever ran the place. Inside was a small square room bisected by a counter, behind which stood shelves with oil cans, bottles of car wax, etc. Even though there was only one window, the area was pretty brightly illuminated by a naked fluorescent lamp. As there was no one in sight, I called "hello" or something, and after a while, a strange little guy emerged from a door in the back wall. In retrospect, I set his age at about 60 to 70 years old, but he could have been somewhat younger, I suppose. When you're 18, you have a tendency simply to label anyone above age 50 as old, I guess. I distinctly remember he had a brownish Greek fisherman cap on, you know, those with a button on the front, and that he had those Coke bottle glasses with thick rims of black plastic. His eyes were magnified to at least twice their natural size by those lenses. I seem to remember he was dressed in a black-white checkered shirt and beige pants held up by braces. You got the impression that it had been a long time since his last bath, as what little hair you could see looked pretty greasy and his clothes were all grubby and wrinkled. I told him I can't remember the exact words, something along the lines that we needed to buy some gas, and he just looked at me for an uncomfortably long time, so I thought he hadn't understood what I'd said. I started to repeat myself, but he cut me off pretty curtly after a few words with a rapid, stuttering manner of speech. Either my memory betrays me, or I never heard just what he said to cut me off, probably something like yes yes mumble mumble, although in Swedish of course, and nodding exaggeratedly as he talked. He started to rummage around beneath the counter, still muttering indistinctly under his breath, and finally produced a key on a piece of string. With the key held out on a straight arm, a really odd gesture, he came out from behind the counter with some speed and pushed quite rudely past me out through the door. He had this strange, sort of lurching kind of locomotion you sometimes see in old alcoholics, an observation I only made years later in another job. Anyway, he unlocked the pump and we drew perhaps 150 krona worth of gas, which took a long time since the pump was ancient and weak. The old guy stood and looked on, all the while rocking from side to side, almost like he'd had some motorical dysfunction or something. My friend and I just sort of looked at each other several times, not knowing what to make of this guy. Once the car was filled up, we pulled our loose cash and just piled it into the hands of the old guy until he seemed satisfied. Once he'd put the money away in a pocket of his pants, he withdrew a wad of blank receipts from a breast pocket, filled one out very carefully with a ballpoint pen, and handed it over. My friend took it without a word and put it in his wallet, and we said goodbye and got into the car and left rather quickly. While we were turning onto the road once again, the old guy walked out into the edge of the tarmac, waving both hands in the air, in a goodbye gesture I guess. When we drove away, I leant forward and looked into the side mirror, seeing him in the distance, still waving and rocking to and fro. We didn't really speak a lot on the way home, but there was no feeling that something was amiss or anything. The only strange thing that happened was that the car started to run raggedly just a few kilometres after leaving the gas station, the engine misfiring in the manner it does sometimes when one or more cylinders fail to ignite. Anyone who's owned a Volkswagen will recognise the phenomena. We commented on it and said that the old guy probably gave us diesel instead of 96 octane petrol. Indeed, the car's exhaust gradually turned into a thick black smoke screen trailing behind us, like it does when you pour diesel into a petrol car. By the time we arrived at our home office, the car coughed and spluttered constantly, so we took it to the civic department's repair shop, by now convinced that we had been sold diesel instead of petrol, and rather pissed because we'd have to empty the gas tank by hand, which is quite messy. A guy at the repair shop helped us out with a hand pump, emptying the gas tank into a large plastic tub. The stuff we pumped out of the tank was neither pinkish as petrol, nor clear like diesel oil, but a milky, opaque orange. It didn't smell right either, but almost sweet, like turpentine. The repair guy, an old fox who probably knew everything there was to know about mechanical stuff, commented that the fluid looked like something called wartime gasoline. Apparently during World War II, petrol was scarce and an alternative was needed. The solution was produced by crudely refined fuel oil mixed with turpentine, or perhaps ethanol, on which petrol engines could be run, albeit not very smoothly. The guy asked us where we'd got the gas, and we told him, chuckling about the strange gas station, even adding that we'd never noticed it before. Now I really expected the guy, as he was really familiar with all the strange people in the area, to laugh along with us and tell us about the strange old guy we met. Instead he looked at us totally confused and said something like, "What gas station?" And it was like a bubble had burst. All of a sudden, I was overwhelmed by how strange it was that we'd never seen this gas station before, and I'd become increasingly certain that, on every previous time we'd driven along the road, it hadn't been there at all. Glancing at my friend's face, it was obvious he was thinking the same thing. We started asking the repair guy if he was really certain about this, and so on, but he maintained that, as far as he was aware, there was no gas station on that stretch of road. He actually began to look quite spooked as my friend and I became more and more agitated. Eventually we left to change out of our work clothes and decided to take my friend's car, drive back the way we came from and see if we could find the gas station. We actually drove the entire way back to the town we'd worked in that day and back again, without ever coming upon the small open area where the gas station had been. It's difficult to describe the feeling that we had when we returned. We were both spooked, scared and exhilarated all at the same time, you know. I sat in the passenger seat with the receipt we'd got from the strange old guy, and to me that mundane piece of grubby paper just seemed to emanate an almost palpable strangeness. I had some serious trouble sleeping for several nights after this, spending lots of my waking time going over this in my head. We actually did a bit of research in the days following this experience, talking to 5 or 6 people we worked with and who we knew had a good knowledge of the area and its history. But no one had ever heard of this gas station, nor had there ever been a gas station there at any time within the last 50 years either. Since our questions led us nowhere, we lost interest after a while and life continued on as normal. At the end of that summer, I left the area for school and didn't think about it for a long time. Occasionally I'd get flashbacks and again feel that falling sensation of strangeness, but I still managed to distance myself from that memory. I certainly didn't tell anyone else about my experience. I did, however, keep the receipt and still have it to this day. Several years later, I believe in 95 or 96, I got into a discussion with my maternal grandfather, who had lived and worked in this area, and told him the story. He responded by saying that he'd had a strange experience on that same road when working as a book courier in the 60s or 70s, but refused to say anything else. He was a devout Baptist and not comfortable discussing this type of thing. I tried several times to get him to tell me what he had experienced, but whatever it was, he took it with him to his grave when he died in 1998. This was the situation until early spring this year, when certain changes in my life prompted me to return and attempt to resolve my feelings concerning this experience. I finally realised just how much this has affected me, and how big an impact it's had on the way my life turned out. I mean, it's hard to feel certainty of anything after an experience like this, isn't it? Anyway, early this year, I had the opportunity to return to my old haunts for a few days, and found myself with some time on my hands, so I decided to try and investigate the matter one more time. I drove along that road at least 10 times in a few days, but still saw no gas station. I was, however, able to find out who owned that stretch of woods where I believed the station appeared to us. Sadly, this turned out to be another blank, as the family I talked with had never heard of any gas station anywhere along that road. So I realise this post is probably a bit longer than it deserves, but I've made an effort to be as precise as possible and to incorporate every detail that I can draw from the murky waters of my memory. I do have a few ideas as to what really happened that day, but I'd like to hear the opinions of the forum before I post those. That'll probably become just as massive a post as this one. Let me know what you think. Regards, David. Let's take a look back at the key facts and interesting talking points. David and his friend had a paranormal encounter, and the date is thought to be July 1993. The paranormal nature of the encounter is uncertain. The most highly speculated theory on the Fortean forum is that they experienced some kind of time or dimensional shift. However, as far as time shifts go, no local experts can corroborate if there was ever a gas station on the road, though so far all claim there was not. No one can seemingly recall if a local farm for a time had a gas or petrol pump that might have been mistaken for a commercial operation if encountered via the time shift. Although farm options have been considered, the details of the story do suggest that this gas station was a commercial operation. There were cans of oil and wax in the window. The attendant pumped the gas for them and then produced a receipt after payment. The compelling nature of David's story is the supposed evidence that was available after the fact. Firstly, the presence of a witness in his friend. Secondly, the receipt that David claims to have. Thirdly, the offending fuel that was drained from the engine. And fourthly, the mechanic who helped drain the tank and then saw and commented on the fuel. David curiously mentions that his late grandfather states he too had a strange occurrence on that same stretch of road, but then is unable to give us any details, even if to confirm that his grandfather's encounter was similar in nature to his own. David would later return to the forum on and off over the next 2 years, and infused commenters would ask him questions. The main thrust of their questions came down to a simple request. David had stated that he had the receipt still, and therefore the question was, David, could you please provide us a copy of it? Unfortunately, David never did so. Over the course of these 2 years, David, through the intercourse of discussion, let additional details about himself and this case be known. He provided the exact coordinates for forum members to view the road via online maps, and some forum members have since driven the road in search for their own evidence, or perhaps in some cases in the hope of having their own encounter with what's become known as the trans-dimensional gas station. Those coordinates, by the way, place the site on the road between Vistra Haag and Jolby. Those coordinates are on screen. David claimed the receipt he tells us he has is in a box somewhere. We come to learn that the emotional distress in his life at that time was the separation and divorce from his wife. It is in the upheaval of moving from the marital home and into an apartment and being somewhat disorganised that is the excuse for having never dug out the receipt. He does often then promise to look for it soon. David also reveals that his friend and companion was called Tony, although he additionally claims not to have spoken to Tony since the end of that summer, and as having been unsuccessful in tracing him since. David posted an email exchange with a journalist from the UK Metro who was probing him for additional information in the hope of publishing this story. The journalist posed a number of questions, some of which were answered and some were not. In that exchange we learn that David is happy for the story to be publicised and for his name to be used, and also that at that time David is living in Gothenburg and claims to now be a scientist working on cancer research. It is now time for me to offer my summary and conclusions. This is an intriguing legend that offers so much. David's first-hand account and the prospect of tangible evidence in the form of the discarded fuel and the handwritten receipt make for an enticing and entertaining modern-day tale. All the elements are there, with just enough vagary for this to be able to pass from story to legend with the addition of time. But let's take a look at a few key points. For all intents and purposes, David's story is framed in a way that seems like a sincere and truthful retelling of an eerie encounter from his youth. The fact that David's story seems to offer a corroborating witness in his friend and companion Tony, plus the fuel supposedly being witnessed by a friendly yet unnamed mechanic, offer us the hope of analysis and substantiation. However, any hope after such an elapse of time for the fuel to be examined now seems beyond negligible, and we have to rely on David's assertion that he tried and failed to locate Tony. In the 15 years which have now passed, we've not just lost the corroborating witnesses, David has not returned to the forum, and of course a copy of the receipt never materialised. This alone seems to be enough within any reasonably objective analysis to pass this story into the fiction section. However, there is a detail that bothers me. Let me frame this as a question. You are David. You are a scientist, and because of some difficulties in your life, you're making changes. But in the course of the upheaval, one thing you decide to do is investigate a paranormal incident that you had a number of years ago. Do you, A, drive up and down the road of the event looking for something you already know is not there? B, post a story on a forum full of Fortean enthusiasts? C, dig out the receipt, the only piece of physical evidence which still exists so it can be verified and tested? Or D, A and B, but not C? The younger David may not have had the life experiences and common sense of his later self, but at the time of posting his recollections, it seems strange to me that if this was an exercise in reanalysing an odd and possibly paranormal event, why he didn't do what any scientist in his audience would suggest and lead with finding and analysing the receipt. When we add to this that David had, supposedly, given consent for a journalist to publish the story, I'm left wondering if what David was really after at this point was some attention. David returns to the comments every now and then for 2 years after the original post. On that particular return, he was quick to ask about the journalist and posted what he presented as email transcripts, but then he vanished soon after. My suspicions in this case are a million miles from my hopes. My head says David posted a fanciful tale. The best deceits have some kernel of truth, and there is a believability and sincerity to his story and his tone. It is only with the benefit of hindsight that in 2019 we know he was not to return and post that promised receipt. David's motivations are clearly unknown, but in my mind the elements of believability are there, and I'm left wondering if this was a calculated hoax. It's too good a story to leave me believing David just never got round to opening a box. For example, in the details of the oil cans, fluorescent lights, slow pumping fuel, the description of the old man, they all paint a picture. With the assertion that the fuel might have been a post-war formula, we get a visual of a post-war fueling station. But the curious detail of the ballpoint pen being used to create the receipt pushes the date back slightly. Although ballpoint pens came to the market in the 1940s, this was initially and primarily in the US. It was only in 1949 that Bic began mass production of ballpoint pens in Europe. And to infer from David's description of the attendant, he doesn't sound much like a trendsetter. Thus it would put our supposed time slip station in a setting probably from the 1950s. But locals confirm that no such station has ever existed on the road, so perhaps it is, as per its name, that it has become famously known by, and it's a trans-dimensional gas station, one which closely approximates how a station might have looked in the 1950s. There is another detail that requires a pause and some consideration. That's of the exchange of currency for the fuel, which is accepted by the attendant. I'm no expert on the history of Swedish currency changes over the years, but would 1990s currency not have changed since the 1950s standards? Assuming it likely would have, why did the attendant accept it and put it in his pocket, per the account? But here again, a subtle detail is inserted to help offer a little doubt for those who want to grab hold of it. The attendant is said to be seen as gesturing behind the car as they drive off, leaving just enough room in the story for the man with milk bottle glasses to have belatedly questioned and protested handling of unfamiliar currency. The doubters can then doubt, and those wanting to believe have something to hold on to. Looking through his later comments on the forum and taking note that he says his field of work is in the worthy fight against cancer, our story, if it is that, now paints its central character who's someone whose life work is focused on a very noble cause. After all, who doesn't respect someone who is working to eradicate such a destructive and horrible condition? So we have now a trustworthy central figure, but we also have two supposed witnesses, two supposed pieces of physical evidence, and a late grandfather who supposedly attests to the spookiness or paranormal potential of that particular stretch of road. Yet when all is said and done, despite much prompting and encouragement, we are just left with David's story, with David's words. Perhaps in my disappointment that David never returned and produced his receipt, I am being too ungenerous. For my hope is that David is out there somewhere. I hope that David just lost his login details for the forum, and in time, perhaps with the importance and busyness of his work, he just never thought to return. I hope David went on to live a happy life and eventually worked his way through those boxes and found that receipt. Maybe he did just that. Maybe he took that receipt and subjected it to the most robust of scientific scrutiny, and today there is a crack team of researchers, top men if you like, focused on working diligently on cracking the enigmas of time and space, and central to that research is all they've learned from actually examining that receipt. But that, of course, is all just fanciful reaching on my behalf. It is such a good story, I just want it to be true. But with deep regret, on the UK Paranormal Files credibility meter, I am tempted to score it as a fairy tale, but I'm going to give credit where it's due and bump it up to a tall tale. If you have enjoyed this video, please click the like button and leave me a comment. Let me know too if you agree with my rating, and if not, where you would score it. If you would like to see more videos, please subscribe to the UK Paranormal Files channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos go up. Oh, and by the way, there is just one more thing, a final thought and a plea. If David is out there, and by some small chance he or someone who knows him watches this video, I want to urge him sincerely to get back on that 14 board and post an update as to where he has been and what has happened since. And more specifically, whether he's ever able to locate and analyse that receipt. This is a tale that would welcome another chapter and a more satisfying conclusion. And David, you can write that ending. Thanks very much for watching.